This is 2024's Salem's Lot. Warning, spoilers ahead. After 2.5 minutes of slow opening credits with the world's most dramatic choir, we meet R.T. Straker as he thanks a gentleman for helping him. I know opening credits are fine for the most part, but they just wouldn't end in this one. Straker tells Snow that a crate will be coming to the wharf that evening and he needs him to retrieve it for him. What's inside the crate is heavy, old, and one of a kind, and it's to be delivered to Straker's new home on the hill. That evening, Snow goes up to the house with Hank and they deliver the crate into the cellar. That is a hell no for me. Cellars are a no-go in general, but there's apparently a spooky history with this house and there's no light whatsoever. I'll pass on the money, thank you very much. The two men carry the crate into the cellar, but they end up dropping it and breaking the corner of it. That was pretty much the one rule that they were supposed to follow. Don't open it or break it. And there's dirt inside? These guys have apparently never read horror books or watched horror movies. This was literally in Dracula. Snow hears a voice calling him closer to the crate, and it's clear that he's being mind-controlled. Luckily, Hank pulls him out of the trance, and the two men hurry out of the cellar. Later, Ben is seen watching the house from his car, and Sheriff Gillespie checks to see what he's doing. Ben reveals that he's a famous author who used to live in the area, and Gillespie warns him that he doesn't want any trouble. After a fair warning, Ben is left to drive into Salem's Lot, but the sign shows that it was once called Jerusalem's Lot. Ben feels a sense of joy as he drives around town, and he stops in front of Straker's shop. Ben heads in to check on Susan, and she's sitting at her desk reading his latest book. Just then, Larry comes into the office to help Ben find a rental property, and when he asks about the Marston house on the hill, Larry explains that Straker bought it after it was vacant for 40 years, and he points out his shop across the street. Larry is the kind of guy that you just don't want to deal with, though. Way too pushy. Thankfully, he's got Susan as a secretary, and she sends Ben to Eva Miller's place. Everyone so far has that small, creepy hometown charm that's well known in Stephen King books. The kind that makes you wonder how anyone can stand to live near them. Across town at school, Mark is showing what an escape artist he is as he has his friends tie him up, but Richie, the school bully, shows up and punches him in the face. Mark isn't the kind of kid to let someone push him around though, and he puts Richie in an arm hold. Mr. Burke breaks them up and sends them on their way. Back in town, Straker watches as Mark and his friends walk down the street after school while Ben is in the library investigating the past of the town and the Marston estate. Suddenly, Susan comes in with her mother, and she finds out about Ben's family dying in a terrible car crash when he was a child. Susan clearly likes Ben, but her subtle hints about going to the drive-in that night is anything but subtle. They're in a library, and she's yelling her plans across 3 rooms. Meanwhile, Mark is showing his friends his room, and it's clear that he has a fascination with horror movies. Mark's friends are worried that Richie is going to retaliate for what happened earlier, but Mark makes it clear that he'll always fight back. That evening, Susan meets Ben at the drive-in theater, and she takes him to her secret spot. On one of the country roads, Straker finds Mark's friends walking down a country road, and he offers them a ride that they respectfully decline. Well, he couldn't have been creepier in the way he asked them. Once someone says no, it's usually best to just leave at that point. Not Straker, though. He just sits there and creepily smiles and watches them walk into the woods. At the drive-in theater, Susan gives Ben a rundown on the local gossip before the movie starts, but Ben is more interested in Susan's story instead. After the sun sets, we see that Mark's friends are still walking through the woods, but soon they realize that they're being followed by something or someone. Straker shows up and snatches Ralph as he falls behind, and then he stashes him in the trunk of his car to take him home. Straker says that his master needs a sacrifice before he transforms the town, and he takes Ralph to see Master Barlow. Well, that's the end of Ralphie. In the morning, Gillespie releases Father Callahan from one of the jail cells, as he had requested to be brought there the night before after drinking, but Gillespie lets him know that he should check in on Ralphie's parents since he disappeared the night before. 1 week later, Ben joins some of the locals to search for Ralphie since he's gone missing, but the locals aren't fond of Ben fancying Susan. Mr. Burke doesn't care though, and he wants him to come to the school to talk to the kids. That night, Ben goes to Susan's house to drop her off, and Susan is embarrassed to find her mother watching them from the window. Meanwhile, Danny is laying in bed thinking of Ralphie, and he thinks that he hears Ralphie outside his window. So he heads outside to investigate, but he ends up getting snatched. Danny doesn't get eaten though. A little later, he shows up at his mom's bed saying that he feels sick, and now we have an idea of how Mr. Barlow is planning to transform the town. A whole town of bloodsuckers? Is this Stephen King's version of 30 Days of Night? At the hospital, Danny's parents are told that he has a vitamin B deficiency, and they plan to wait and see if he gets better. Vitamin D deficiency, my butt! Danny is reaching for the blood bag while having a raspy voice. Wait, he drinks the blood bag and ends up dying? Was he a vampire who was allergic to blood? That would suck. During the funeral, Father Callahan's helper, Mike, ends up falling asleep in the cemetery. He wakes up at night, he goes to cover the coffin. It turns out that Danny isn't all that dead though, and he attacks the worker after escaping his coffin. The next day, Ben speaks to Mr. Burke's students about being an author. Then Mr. Burke goes to the local bar to catch up on some reading. He spots a shadowy figure sitting in the dark, and he goes to find out that it's Mike, the funeral assistant. He's clearly sick like Danny was, and says that he's too scared to go home. Mr. Burke offers for him to stay at his place for the night, and Mike is thankful. No! Not Mr. Burke! He's like the one character in this story that feels like the good guy. Ben doesn't even feel like a good guy. Mr. Burke notices 2 pinprick marks on Mike's neck, and later that night, he notices a strange being crawling into his upstairs window. He heads to Ben's place to ask him for a cross, but when he sees Susan is with him, he asks both of them to follow him back to his place. He explains how he thinks Mike is a vampire, and while he knows that it sounds crazy, he is set on the theory being true. All of them head inside to check on Mike in his room, and while he's seen to be sleeping, Susan doesn't think that he's breathing. No breathing, cold skin, the pinpricks on his neck are gone. Yep, I'd say you got a vampire on your hands. With Mike seemingly dead, Ben thinks that Mr. Burke should call the authorities and not mention any ideas of him being a vampire. Later, the authorities show up, and it seems clear that everyone has a sneaking suspicion of something supernatural going on. Later that night, Mark wakes up when he hears banging on his window, and he can see a ghostly child looking through his window. Mark is the smartest child in a horror movie I've ever seen. He immediately closes the shades and refuses to let the kid in. If it weren't for mind control, Mark would have been the ideal hero of this story. Hey, finally a vampire movie that still follows the lore as far as crucifixes. After repelling vampire Danny, Mark goes to his horror comics to get his knowledge of vampires. Just like the Frog Brothers and the Lost Boys. While Mark is learning everything he can, Mr. Burke is doing the same thing in his own home, but he stops when he hears creaking in his house. Suddenly, Vampire Mike shows up, but Mr. Burke is prepared with a crucifix. I love how the crucifixes glow when vampires are near. It's like Bilbo's sting from The Hobbit. Saves energy with flashlights, too. After almost getting mind controlled, Mr. Burke grabs another crucifix and revokes his information that he gave to Mike. I didn't know you could do that. That changes things drastically. The next day, Dr. Cody finds out that Mike's body isn't in the morgue anymore, and she goes to visit Mr. Burke to find an absolute mess and Mr. Burke unconscious on the floor. After Mr. Burke wakes up, he tells Dr. Cody about the vampires after Ben and Susan come over. All of his clues lead to Straker being Master Barlow's lackey, and they decide to dig up Danny's coffin to see if he's still buried. Dr. Cody explains that Danny's mother was found dead earlier, and she would rather wait until night to see if she's a vampire instead. Later, Mr. Burke finds Straker dancing with Susan's mother at his shop, and he heads toward the manor. At the same time, Mark is already there with a wooden stake, and he goes down into the cellar. Okay, Mark might be brave for all of this, but he loses points for going down alone. Mr. Burke finds Mark in the cellar, but suddenly they're locked in by Straker. While Mr. Burke tries to boost Mark up into the house, Master Barlow creeps out of his crate and attacks Mr. Burke while Mark is snatched up. Meanwhile, Dr. Cody, Ben, and Susan go to check on Mrs. Glick's body, and sure enough, she rises from the table as a vampire. After making a cross from the tongue depressors, the group is able to defend itself, but it falls apart thanks to bad tape. Mrs. Glick ends up biting Dr. Cody before Susan is able to make the cross again, and this time she places the cross on her and she disappears. Dr. Cody gives herself a rabies shot to counteract the bite, and they test everything out with the cross. With it not glowing, they think that they're safe. Doesn't it take some time to let the bite take effect? I'd be tying the cross to her. Actually, hang a bunch of them on her just in case. The group decides to go to Mr. Burke's house, but they notice the vampires on the roof, and Ben pieces together that Mr. Burke is already one of them. The next day, Mark finds himself tied up in the manor, but he manages to escape his bonds before Straker shows up. Whoa! Mark actually takes him out! He at least puts a really bad whooping on him. Hopefully it was enough to keep him down. Meanwhile, Ben, Susan, and Dr. Cody are trying to convince Father Callahan that vampires are real, but he seems to be having a tough time seeing things their way. Just then, Mark pops up and tells them that Mr. Burke is a vampire now. Mark is just there to get some holy water, and everyone is surprised to see how knowledgeable he is on the matter. After hearing about how Mark had to take out Straker, Father Callahan asks to see where this all happened. Everyone goes to the manor on the hill, and everyone is really spooked. Even more so when the door to the cellar creeps open on its own. At this point, I don't think I'd care too much about saving the lot. It's time to grab what you can and leave this messed up town before nightfall. Everyone goes into the cellar to investigate, and Ben tries to stake Mr. Burke when he pops up and surprises them. He misses the heart, but the others are able to open the cellar door. The sunlight burns him enough to get him off of them, and Ben doesn't miss with the second stake. Now that Father Callahan believes them, they all leave to figure out a plan for the whole town, and they agree to rally as many people as they can to get to the church before sundown. Dr. Cody tries to talk to Gillespie, but he already knows vampires and plans to leave before sundown. When Susan and Ben go to talk to her mom, she tells them that she's already agreed to serve Barlow, and suddenly, Susan is bitten by a vampire. Ben rushes to take her out. Well, this town is a lost cause. I really think everyone should just leave. What is this vampire that's attacking Mark's family? Is this Barlow? This is the coolest looking vampire that I've seen in a long time. Father Callahan manages to save Mark, but he's taken along with Mark's parents. Mark hides in his treehouse, and he shuts all of the entrances. Meanwhile, Ben rushes Susan to the church where Dr. Cody is waiting, but it's clear that Susan is too far gone as she reacts to being on holy ground. Susan rushes off of the grounds, and Ben follows her. Look at all of those vampires! Barlow's ranks went from 1 to 100 real quick. Dr. Cody and Ben rush back into the church just in time, and in the morning, they can see the ghost town that Salem's Lot has become. They go to Mark's house to see the carnage that was left behind, and they see that Mark left a note about where he went. He's gone to kill Barlow himself. Mark goes to Straker's shop to look around, but the cut he has on his hand alerts the vampires to his presence. He stakes Vampire Danny, but that's all he finds in there. When he leaves the shop, Ben and Dr. Cody pull up, and Mark manages to convince them to fight back instead of running. Ben notices that all of the cars are missing, and they head to the drive-in to find all of the vehicles parked. When Ben opens the trunk of Susan's car, he finds her sleeping there. Odd choice for a makeshift coffin, but I guess it works just the same, especially for the time period. Just when Dr. Cody gets ready to stake Susan, she gets blown away by Susan's mother. Ben and Mark run in between the cars to escape the crazed woman, and suddenly the sun sets on the lot. All of the car trunks open as the vampires wake up, but Mark manages to save Ben as he jumps in a car and breaks the support beams on the movie screen. With the sun shining through, all of the vampires catch on fire. Another point for Mark as he runs Susan's mother over. I've never cheered for a fictitious 11-year-old as much as I've cheered for Mark. With only minutes of sunlight left, the two of them find where Barlow's coffin is being held in the back of a truck, and Ben pulls it out into the sunlight. They can't open it though, and with the sunlight running out, Ben rushes to find something to pry it open with. They run out of time though, and as Barlow comes out, they rush into the concession stand. Oh crap! Susan is still going! And now Mark is handling Barlow on his own? If anyone in this story can handle the head vampire, it's definitely going to be him though. After a tough struggle, Ben stakes Susan in the heart, and he rushes out to help Mark with Barlow. Luckily for Mark, Ben gets to them just in time, and he puts an end to the head vampire. Ben and Mark hop into a car, and they drive off down a misty county road. Then the credits roll. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more like this one. Comment what you think I should watch next, and I'll see you in the next video.